Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Make sure I have all the bases covered. Thank you very much for joining. This is our third in a series tied to circular supply chains, and we'll be looking specifically at workforce management. My name is Mike Boyle, and I appreciate you joining us today. And we have something very, very special. I'd like to go ahead and bring Andrea Bassi to the stage. Andrea, thank you very much for joining us today. Oh, sorry, let me go ahead and unmute you.
Done.
You feel empowered. That's even better. That makes my job much easier. So in any case, Andrea, thank you very much. Maybe to give everyone a bit of information tied to you. Let me go here. Yeah, so Andrea is the founder and CEO of Knowledge SRL, and he has some really cool things to show us today. And I've been looking forward to this event for a long, long time. And I know that we've had this planned because you're a very busy individual. So thank you very much for joining us, Andrea. There was one point, and I mentioned this to you before we actually got started. I'd like to go ahead and highlight something that I ran across. I can't remember exactly in which podcast that was, but there was a stat that came through where they were mentioning that in the United States, 1 in 4 American workers plan to look for a new job once the pandemic is over. And I thought that was quite interesting because for me, this has something directly to do with that of what we'll be talking about. You know, when we talk about external forces and looking at circularity and the goal being, of course, making that transition to the circular economy and the disruption that will take place within the supply chain. Well, COVID has made this one very, very interesting because, of course, there are a lot of things that we don't know what's going to happen. I think we know a little bit more than we realize. COVID actually put everything onto steroids. That means that the whole transition process, in my mind, has gone onto steroids. And so it should be very, very interesting looking at what you'll be showing us today and trying to understand, well, how does this actually apply to actually something that's a lot closer than what we realize? So again, Andrea, thank you very much for joining. And I believe you have some slides that you'd like to go ahead and share before we actually go in the program. So consider yourself empowered.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Mike. And thanks for all that have joined at this event. So I think you used a very important word before, transition. I mean, we are in constant transitions. Regardless of what COVID has done, which has accelerated this transition that we are living in for the economic development, for jobs, for digitalization, for instance, we have been in constant transitions all the time. And that depends on whether we implement policies or whether we have an underlying evolution in the context we live in, whether it's personal or professional and so on and so forth. So what we're trying to understand here with the type of tools that I'm going to present today is how do we manage transitions? How do we understand the causes for change? How do we stimulate the change that we want and sort of avoid the change that we don't want to happen, those side effects or trade-offs that we have to deal on a daily basis, again, whether it's on a personal level or professional level. So I have a few slides here that introduce a tool, a model, a simulation model that was developed to understand the extent to which circular economy jobs could be created out of making a few interventions in the system, policies or standards or promoting technological change, so that we can see the extent to which the potential for job creation could be exploited within the context of a circular economy. What I'm presenting today is a suite of models that were developed for a specific project. And so in this case, we have carried out a circular economy assessment that is customized to the context of Finland for a few specific sectors and products. Now, I will focus today on the presentation of the tool, just to give an idea of how this type of assessment is carried out, but will not really emphasize too much the finish case. On the other hand, we have looked at consumer electronics and appliances, textiles, food, mostly the primary food production aspect, mining and scrap metals, forestry and paper production, and then buildings. Now, these are a diverse set of products and sectors that all have different characteristics in relation to the potential for implementing a circular economy strategy. But what I want to show you is how we can break down that complexity with the same type of tools, of course, with some customization here and there, but nevertheless with a coherent underlying approach. The models that we have developed are based on a methodology called system dynamics. This is not something I have created. It has been created in the 1950s, late 1950s, by Jay Forrester at the MIT in the US. And it was created as a methodology to understand feedback relationships. So basically, just to give you a bit of a history for the methodology, Jay Forrester is the person that actually created or conceived and then created the random access memory for laptops. And his underlying approach was the following, that we don't need to have all the information required being available at the same time on a computer. We just have to have a smaller set of information that we need right now being readily available, and then we can call upon other information as needed. And so he envisaged this feedback process where you call up information and you send it back on a needs basis. And he started thinking, well, this type of approach should be applied to policymaking. And so he started working on urban dynamics and industrial dynamics, and that is what led to the creation of the system dynamics methodology. Now, as you can imagine, the field has grown over time. We have hundreds of universities teaching courses on this. But what we're doing here is a specific application of this methodology to a specific problem related to circular economy strategies. So we dig deep into one specific area of intervention with corresponding models that are developed for that purpose. Now, in order to develop these models, we follow a few key steps. First of all, we need to identify what are the research questions. So this is just to highlight that the model is not built to analyze the whole system that we are interested in, but the model is built to answer a question. So it's a problem-specific model, and we need to identify out of the problem we have, which portions of the system are relevant to analyzing that problem. So what are the boundaries of the system to analyze? So in this case, we want to look at the estimation of the job implications of circular economy transitions. Now, that is our specific purpose with this exercise. Then we want to identify what we call dynamic hypothesis, which is what causes change, basically. And we do that with the creation of a system map, meaning that we want to develop what we call a causal diagram, which is a system map, to identify what are the key variables in the system and how they're interconnected with one another using causality. So A leads to B, B leads to C, and so on and so forth. Now, this is normally done with group model building / co-creation approach, meaning that we want to make sure that we include in our analysis all the key elements that are necessary to understand the research question that we are set to answer. Now, as the name of the methodology sort of implies, system dynamics, we don't look at one specific sectoral or thematic analysis. We look for a systemic assessment with social, economic, environmental variables. And in order to capture all these dimensions, we need to have expertise around the table when we develop these diagrams and maps for all these different areas. That's why I mentioned that we do co-creation, because we need to bring in the knowledge. We need to do knowledge integration across different fields, domains, and teams. And that can be captured by having a multi-stakeholder approach and having a few people at least contributing to the process. Now, that map we create with this co-creation approach is then used to identify what are the key indicators, the data we need, and the type of model we need to develop. So the next steps would be data collection, model creation with numbers and equations, model validation, and then simulation of alternative results. Now, this is a bit the modeling process. As you see, first step to understanding complexity is we need to take that systemic approach because reality is complex. We have social, economic, and environmental factors interacting in reality. Now, that has to be embedded in the model. And so we have to take that broader approach when we develop these models. Then, what is included in the model now that we know what was the process that was followed? When it comes to circular economy, we need to look at consumption patterns, production, and materials management, meaning that we need to look at how products are consumed. So what is the demand for products consumed and used, basically? How the amount of products required in an economy translates into production. So what would be the demand for producing these products? Then we assess the production processes to understand how much of the material input becomes output in terms of the product produced, and how much may be, so to say, waste, like unused materials that are considered to be waste from a production point of view. Then we start looking at materials management, which includes both the materials that are not being used actively that result as waste from the production process, but also the products, when they get discarded, they can be managed in a way that can be used for recycling, reuse, can be sent to landfilling, and so on. So materials management is seen here as a broader concept when you have both the waste from the production process, but also the waste as product discard after the end of the lifetime of the product. And here, as a result of this, again, to try and break down the complexity of the circular economy, we had to look at a range of products and at the same time sectors. Products, because this is where the demand comes from. This is where the consumption side comes in. But at the same time, we need to look at sectors because we need to assess both the production processes, but also because some of the materials we consume are materials used for the creation of final products. So these are intermediate products. And so we don't have final consumption as a starting point all the time, but we may have intermediate consumption. So sectors like mining, forestry, or if you think of buildings with construction and retrofits, they have to be looked at as sectors because they don't provide necessarily a product that is sold as a final product itself. So this selection was made in collaboration with CITRA, the Finnish Innovation Agency, just to have a broad range of sectors and products, just to look at what could be the implications across heterogeneous or a diverse range of products and sectors for their own economy. Now, these are then embedded into the model via the creation of standalone models. Like we have a model for buildings, we have a model for mining, we have a model for electronics, and so on and so forth. And there are some key features that are common to all these models. First is the use of stocks and flows, meaning that we need to take into account the accumulation of products and materials in the economy over time, meaning that we need to know how much is, let's say, purchased of a product, for how long this product will be used, say a lifetime of 3, 4, 5 years for a laptop, for instance. So we need to know how many units we have in the economy at any given point in time. And then we need to know what is the discard rate, meaning how many laptops, let's say, are being discarded after they reach the end of their lifetime, after the 5 years, so that we can keep track of the purchase, the amount of products in the economy, and the discard. Now, the purchase is what gives us input for the production process. If we buy something, it has been produced, it is available, or we place an order and it will be produced to order, basically. The amount that is in the stock represents what has been produced and may become waste at some point in time, or it will become waste at a given point in time based on the lifetime of the appliance or product that we consider. So that this gives us an overall idea of how much is required, how much will be produced, and the waste generated in the production process. And then if we know how many products are in the stock of the economy, then we know how many will need to be managed in the future so that we can plan ahead of time for managing that flow of products and materials, again, for recycling, reuse, and so on and so forth, repurposing, maybe refurbishing. And so this is sort of the framework we apply to all the sectors, a stock and flow relationship. We take a physical approach as opposed to a purely economic approach. So we look at the stock of the units of phones, for instance, the units of laptops, for instance, the cubic meters of textile, or the square meters, of textile products that are produced. And then out of that, we then determine how we need to plan, basically the production process and the materials management process. Now, we do have also some feedback loops that come into play into the model, meaning circular relationships. For instance, the fact that when we are discarding a product, say a laptop, then we automatically trigger the purchase of a new product to replace the one that has been discarded. So this gives us an idea of the overall flow of products and materials throughout the economy to the medium and longer term, and we are forecasting up to 2040 with the model. Now, what are the similarities and differences between these different models and other approaches? So first of all, we have developed models that are standalone. Most of the times when it comes to circular economy, we see macroeconomic models being used, meaning models that look at the whole economy and consider the impact that we implement or we obtain in one sector on other sectors as well. So you have the knock-on effect or the domino effect onto other sectors. Now, this is normally done at the sectoral level because we know what are the interrelationships between the different sectors. In this specific case, since we start mostly from the products, it's very difficult to obtain information on what are the relationships between one product within one sector and the performance of other sectors. just because we don't have data that are disaggregated to the level we need for the specific products as they're embedded in one sector. So we take this standalone approach, but nevertheless, at some point, having enough of these products and sectors, we could aggregate them and have a more macroeconomic point of view. So that is one of the differences between this approach and others. We take a bottom-up approach, while most of the others I've seen so far and found in the literature take more of a top-down approach. At the same time, we look at one country. In this case, we look at Finland. So we have import and export, but the model is not a multi-country model, meaning that we don't see the consequences for a specific exporting country if there is a new policy on circular economy being implemented for Finland. Now, this is very important to mention because when you describe a model, you should always describe what are the limitations or caveats or the underlying assumptions that have been made so that we can better interpret the results of the model. So we always need to look at numbers in relation to structure and what is included in the model. Then some more technical considerations, and then I will show the model directly. The model that we run in this case functions in a simulation mode or what-if mode, meaning that it doesn't optimize flows. It doesn't say, if this is your target, this is the best setup for your own system. Instead, it runs as follows. The input for the model is an assumption about either a policy or a change that is going to happen in the system. For instance, we would say, what if we're able to extend the lifetime of a product because we change the design of that product to last longer, a longer amount of time? Let's say we move from 5 years for a laptop to 7 years because it's built in a modular way so that certain elements, certain components can be replaced more easily in the future. Now, the model then will run this what-if scenario to say, what would happen if, in fact, we are able to shift that lifetime to 7 years? Now, this is due for a very specific reason. Models are simplifications of reality, so they simplify the complexity of reality, and they can be optimized. But in reality, the underlying conditions that would normally be included in a model keep changing all the time. And reality is never as perfect or optimal as you will find in the model. So instead of finding an optimum, we want to create a tool that can help guide and inform decision-making step by step. So that a decision maker could say, if I'm able to achieve this, let's see what are the consequences in the rest of the model. If there are some side effects that would normally be countered by an optimization process because the model finds the optimum, adjusting dynamics within its structure. But if there is something that doesn't go 100% right, then this type of analysis will show it. We'll say, look, you achieve your targets here, but you're going to create a side effect there. Or, for instance, you have this decision implemented here, but in order to implement it properly, you need to create this many jobs there. So you need to make sure you have enough of the capabilities, the skills, and the people, and so on and so forth, to realize it properly. So in other words, we want to create a model that does not give the optimal answer, but a model that allows users to ask the right questions, like to be prepared for whatever change may come up in the system, whether it's desired or unwanted, regardless. Then we do run the model from the year 2000 to 2040, while most models, especially optimization ones, would normally start from next year. So we take the latest data point, and then from that point on, 2019 or 20 or 21, we start optimizing. In this case as well, instead, system dynamics allows to assess causality over time. And so the simulation we run from 2000 to 2018 or 2019 is actually used to validate whether our equations are able to reproduce historical behavior. In other words, we tend to say here that we need to generate the right behavior, so right model results, for the right reason. And so this is very important for us to check that the model, in fact, can reproduce the right dynamics that we see in reality. And then a final point here is that the model runs in a semi-continuous time, meaning that it shows changes over time with less than a monthly time step. So it doesn't go in 5 years intervals, for instance. So it shows the potential emergence of worse before better situations, when the situation may get worse in the short term out of the implementation of a policy. But then if we give time for the implementation of the policy to sink in, then we see the emergence of positive outcomes. So we want to show here explicitly the delays that are embedded in the system. Like, for instance, if you change ownership, if you extend the lifetime of a product, then you may have a a short-term negative effect on the production side, meaning producers will see less demand. But at the same time, you will see cost savings on the waste management side. So we do this to have these delays explicitly embedded in the model to be able to assess a system's performance as the performance of a system and all of its components, rather than prioritizing the maximization of the performance for one component only, that could be manufacturing, as opposed to waste management. So this delay component is very, very important for this type of assessments. Now, here is an overview of the model. This is where most people will just turn around, turn on music, put their earphones off, and say, okay, that's it. That's enough for me. I don't want to do any more of this. But I wanted to show it to you so that you get an idea of what this model actually looks like. So practically, it's not a spreadsheet model. It is a model that works with a software called Vensim, developed by Ventana Systems. There are different versions available online if you're interested. And it does provide a graphical interface so that we can graphically see what are the flows, for instance, product purchase, how they accumulate in the stock, for instance, the amount of products in use at any given point in time, and then how these stocks is reduced by product discard based on the product lifetime. So we have a step-by-step representation of that causality that I mentioned before. Then this model, what you see here, follows more or less a material flow management type of approach, where we see that we have product discard that becomes products that are available for collection. This is waste collection, basically. And then you have the total stock of products collected, and you need to decide what to do with this. So for instance, this could be dismantled for recycle or reuse. And you see that for each of these specific material flows, we have some pink variables here that represent employment. For instance, if you have product purchase, we have employment from retail. If you have product discard and collection, then we have employment from product collection. If we have recycling, then we see here employment for product recycling. Then, of course, we also have employment from landfilling that you see out here on the right side, which is sort of the end of the line for most of the products that we have. Some can be incinerated, for instance. Some can be recycled and reused based on materials as opposed to product recycling. And then we have here, for instance, other interventions that are important also for the circular economy, which have to do with material consumption, water, and energy input for the production process. So as you can see, we cover a broad range of factors, variables here that belong to different elements or different parts of the circular economy definition. Here you can see them overlaid with the diagram. We have demand as one important aspect. So how many products will be demanded, required in the economy? That drives production that you see over here. And then on the right side, we have all the materials management component of the circular economy. So we can see that overall, we have our demand that affects production. The demand with the products used defines the product collection and recycling. But on the other hand, if you continue at the bottom of the diagram, production leads to material and resource consumption for the production process. Now, these normally would go straight into landfilling and incineration, because when these are labeled as waste, it's difficult to use them in different ways. On the other hand, some of these could be also recycled and reused. Possibly the waste of one industry or company can be sent as an input for another one. And also when it comes to landfilling and incineration, we have the products we don't use anymore. If you have an old laptop, we go to the recycling station and just throw it away into electronics. But nevertheless, instead of being landfilled, some of these can also be recycled, dismantled and recycled to extract valuable materials, say copper and so on and so forth. So that overall, what we want to do is then minimize that landfilling and incineration process. Now, what we have here on the top right corner is total employment. So this is where ultimately we can do our assessment, where we say, everything we do in changing the flows of materials will determine the needs for jobs. And where, again, we need to be careful and plan for the types of skills that are required, the capacity building that needs to be carried out, and so on and so forth. Now, in terms of the overview of the model, as I said before, we're basically done. We have products and sectors. We look at electronics as a specific example with the model in a couple of minutes. And then we have different employment categories, both for products and materials. As I said before, these would be all the pink variables that we saw in the diagram. Now, as you can imagine, one very important final point As I said, what we've done in this case is mostly knowledge integration. And that means that we need to take data sources from a variety of different reports and databases and plug them together into one single model. So most of what we do in this case, to take that systemic approach and really break down the complexity of the problem, is to do data consistency checks, meaning that we may get employment numbers from a source, but then we have material flow data from another source. And when we combine the two to see what is the labor intensity of a specific process, the numbers may not match. You may end up with a very high number for employment creation, unrealistically high, or an extremely small number, also unrealistically low. Because, for instance, some of the jobs that are performed in this case for, say, collection, recycling, and reuse concern a much larger volume of products, not just the single one that we are analyzing. So a lot of the work that we do in this case to break down the complexity and really explore what may happen in the system when you implement new policies is to integrate knowledge, which ultimately results in a lot of cross-checking for the data that we use. Now, in terms of results, let's move on to seeing how the model works and how it behaves before an actual demonstration of the model. We see two main dynamics when we look at the circular economy potential. On the one hand, there is strong job creation potential for recycling, as you can imagine, in the context of electronics, for instance, because we have a higher volume and higher labor intensity for these activities. Practically here, we are creating new jobs that otherwise would not be present in a conventional scenario. We also have a relevant job creation potential for resource management activities, for mining and forestry, for instance, or for sustainable infrastructure in the case of buildings. Because this is, again, where we are introducing new practices. So in a way, for a company, this means introducing more costs, but at the same time, like on the management of materials, but at the same time, it reduces costs on the need to get rid of waste. And so here we see job creation potential, which is also positive because, again, we create jobs and the cost on the one hand, but we create savings on the other hand. There are also other areas where we see potential job losses, and this is where demand and local production are impacted negatively. So this is food production and processing. For instance, if we reduce food waste, then we could potentially produce less than what we're producing now, and this is where we could see job losses. Same with textile. If we say that we avoid looking at what is in fashion this year or next year, and we say whenever we buy something, we use it for at least 10 years, let's say, this fast fashion concept sort of goes away, then we would be able to reduce the amount of products and clothing that is produced every year. And that may have a negative impact on production and jobs in the sector. So overall, we see transitions happening, as I said before, and these differ from sector to sector. And this is where it's important to have a similar underlying approach for the comparability of results, but then at the same time, different parameterization and different equations as needed. Now, moving on to the demonstration of the model. As I said, we have a few intervention options that we are considering. Here you see the ones for electronics, just summarized. We could change the lifetime of products. We could change the share of products that are refurbished and resold, as opposed to being just thrown away and then we sell new ones. And then increase the recycling fraction for materials. Now, with the models here, you will see we can run a scenario in a matter of a second. It's instantaneously set up to run a new scenario. And in a report like this one, we have summarized 3 main scenarios. But when we use the model itself, we have a lot more flexibility. Of course, what goes in a PDF file has to be concise, precise, and clear. And so we don't normally put more than 3 scenarios or so. Some more may go into an annex. But what we can do with the model is very different. So I'll stop sharing my screen here, and I'll start sharing the screen where I have the mathematical model open so that you can see how it looks like in practice.
Perhaps, Andrea, we had received a couple questions, and in fact, I would even have one of my own. If we could just briefly go to them, and then we'll continue with your going through the actual program, if that's okay for you. I believe you answered the questions. Dora came up with 2. One is where is the reduction of the demand in this model? I think I heard it in your description, but perhaps maybe if you can just kind of briefly elaborate on that.
Yes. So we take into account demand, for instance, for electronic products. So we look at what is the average ownership of products per person. Let's say out of the whole country, we may have 0.5 laptops per person. This means one laptop every 2 people. So that is embedded as a starting point. It's one of the policy levers we can modify to either change, increase or decrease that level of ownership. And that will then be carried through the production process, the amount of products that are in the system, in the stock, in the economy, and then the ones that get discarded, for instance. So the starting point is the product ownership at the very, very top of the chain in the model.
Great. And let me go ahead and move to the second question that Dora asked. This is tied to understanding better distribution. I believe you covered that specifically at the end of your demonstration, looking at the different scenarios, but perhaps if you'd like to go ahead and elaborate on that one as well.
Yes. So this is important. I mean, it's not something that you can normally grasp entirely with simulation models, but at the same time, you can see the extent to which, for instance, moving the system to more refurbishing and then reusing or repurposing products supports the creation of local businesses, for instance, as opposed to large conglomerates that work out of economies of scale. So we could infer, and this could be connected to other work that I've done on the territorial potential for circular economy, that there would be strategies that work better for an urban context as opposed to strategies that may work better for a rural context. But nevertheless, these circular economy interventions tend to decentralize economic activity, different types of economic activity, to make it more balanced between large players and small players.
Great. Now, I have a question for you, and this is, you mentioned the word data consistency. Now, this might be implied that you're referring to data integrity, and especially as you mentioned the word material flow analysis, I think this is certainly, looking from my perspective, one of the challenges that I have, that we have different departments that are responsible for gathering different data. And we always make the concentration on the end of the stream, that being starting when we get to the waste. Whereas if we understand that good input allows us to create good output, or conversely, bad input allows, more or less forces us to have bad output. What is your feeling towards that actual integrity of the data, especially upstream, because we don't necessarily always know what are the components of those things that we're actually bringing into our environment?
Yeah, it's a good point. It comes up all the time, as you can imagine. The issue that we have, I believe, is that, and it's not only an issue, of course, there are reasons for that, but one of the problems that we have with data is that they're collected within single departments, and they have depth of knowledge in the specific area they work in. And normally data collection is driven by policy needs. Like if you need to assess a policy, an investment, if you have a target for, say, economic growth or job creation, then we want to look at data that present what is the state of things, like if you're doing well or not, or what is the potential to improve. And so we have these different levels. Like we have the technical knowledge within a department, and then we have the policy input that comes from other people and other experts. Now, the policy input is not always related to the full chain of causality that basically comes into play from item A to item Z, that is the end, the indicator that we need for policy. And so we end up with this somewhat fragmented process when you have policy needs driving the data collection for certain indicators that are then somewhat disconnected from other indicators that come upstream, because there is a lack of that full causal chain in the system. At the same time, we may have different methods for collecting data. So we may have just different definitions that are being used, maybe not within the same sector, but across different sectors or across different ministries. Because when you have a ministry, say, of public works interacting with the Ministry of Finance, they just speak different languages, different professional languages. And so they would use necessarily different methods for collecting the same type of data even. So there is a lot of interpretation, assessment, analysis, and interpretation that has to come along with the review of data. We cannot simply just take data from two different places and assume they're perfectly consistent and plug them into a model. The model will lead to results that are normally not realistic just because of that, because there is an underlying inconsistency across different data sets.
Yeah, and I would even go ahead and argue that it's not necessarily only exclusively tied to the data per se, but in the mindset of the individuals who are responsible, getting back to your question of policy, because let's be honest, you talked about system dynamics. We as human beings have a struggle in actually following non-transitional way, or one non-transactional way of looking at things, i.e. system thinking. And so I tend to think in your experience, and I know we're going a little bit off-road here because you've been concentrating on the technical, but we shouldn't forget that there are human beings that are also involved. The ability to actually truly understand the entire end-to-end process, starting from the actual resource extraction to the end of life of whatever product we might be looking at. And so I'm wondering if maybe, and you can save this to the end if you'd like, if you would have any suggestions looking from a purely technical perspective of maybe some things that we can take on from a societal perspective to actually go ahead and address those. Any feedback along those lines would be quite useful.
Yeah, it's a great point. I touched upon this briefly early on when I said that when we develop a model, we do that co-creation of system maps. That's exactly the system thinking approach, right? Mm-hmm. Because I've been doing this for 20 years, and I can tell you very clearly, my understanding of a system is very different when I'm confronted with the opinion of other 20 people that stay in the room and they share their own views, right? As a consultant, I know very well my limitations. If I go to Indonesia, if I go to Brazil, I know I don't know the local context well. But sometimes, I had some very big surprises for how wrong I got, why the system works in a certain way or the other way, just by looking at statistics. Like the underlying explanation from locals can change considerably. So it is extremely important that we have that shared understanding, because in good faith, we all think we provide the right explanation. But we don't realize it may not be the right explanation. It's just our own interpretation, which we call a mental model. So it is very important to have this sort of mental model presented on paper so that it's a step-by-step process. It allows us and other people participating in the process to be better aligned and to learn from one another. So that ultimately we don't prepare a policy that only works for us. And I go back to different ministries and different decision makers. It doesn't work only for one department, but it actually works for everyone in the system. Now, here we're introducing a different problem, though, is that our planning is not done to optimize the system. It's done to optimize performance of compartments of the system. For instance, the Ministry of Finance wants to maximize economic growth. But if we increase economic growth, that creates problems for other people. It creates problems for the health sector, for instance, because more economic growth, more waste generation, more emissions, more health impacts, more costs for health. But that is not normally taken into account explicitly when determining what is the right way to grow and achieve that GDP growth target. So we don't plan for systems. We plan for individual performance, because we are assessed against our individual performance and not the performance of the whole system.
That's wild what you just said, because you described both the inadequacy or the challenge we have in the existing system and the potential of what you're doing. You did that all in one sentence. Good job. Another comment from Dora, looking at the both private and public sector is notoriously protective of information. And I can only vouch that. Dora, thank you very much for mentioning that. How can they be convinced about becoming more transparent?
Well, my experience tells that if, as a modeler, I go to them and bring them a model, they will not be convinced. Like they will say, well, this is your view. And they will always say, we know better than you do, because it's my government, it's my company. And on the other hand, my experience has been very positive when we have that co-creation process being implemented to say, I'm just here facilitating the process to develop a model for you. And that is a uniquely customized model that works only for them. So on the one hand, they see that I'm not going to profit from receiving their data, and I'm not going to sell them or use them for other purposes, because they're used only for that one model that works only for them. And what I've noticed is that if the model is used not to provide the answer, right, not to provide information on what to do, but instead the model is provided to tell them what not to do. Like if you tell them, avoid this because clearly it doesn't lead to the outcomes you want, but then you're in charge of identifying what you want to do to achieve your targets, then it becomes their model, right? It's their data, their model. They're in charge of finding the solution. And so this is what shows them the value, right? It shows them why it is important to share the data, because otherwise it will be time and resources wasted, right? So as a consultant, you need to show them that you can leverage their information to develop something more useful. If you just get the data and then you tell them something they already knew, they don't see value, then they will refrain from sharing even more information. And that happens all the time.
And not only that, I'd like to go ahead and make this, especially for my students that are watching, take what Andrea just said right now and apply it to multiple situations, because it's always the case. If they feel that that what's being created is yours and not theirs, that's really the problem you're discussing. And so it's always important to make sure that you're giving them the impression always that this is theirs and that you're doing it for them. That's extremely important. And I apologize for holding you up so much, but I think I was actually pretty good because I was able to get you to talk about a few things that I think were very, very important. So let me go ahead and give you back the stage so you can actually go ahead and show us the application.
Yes. So you should be able to see now on the screen the actual model. So what the model looks like. You see it's very similar to what I presented in the slide before. It was a screenshot from the model. But this is what the modeling platform looks like. Of course, we have a line-by-line code that I don't want to show. It's not that useful, but normally use this graphical overview of the model. Now, you can see here some of the main components that I discussed before, and I'll zoom in a little bit more so you can see them more clearly. If you start from the left side, we go from left to right. Here we have desired product ownership, is what you see here in these different variables. We have the number of users, which would be a subset of the population or a total population, depending on the sector you want to analyze. And then we have desired product ownership. So what percentage of the population will have that specific product we're analyzing? And this is for electronics specifically. Now, once we have the total demand for electronics, we compare that with the amount of products we already have to see what is the demand for new electronics, like what is the demand for new purchases every given year. Now, that determines our product purchase that we see here. And you see every variable is assigned or a unit, and there is an equation behind it as well. And then this product purchase accumulates in the total stock of products in use at any given point in time. Now, then we have the product lifetime. That is one of the policies that we can change, because product lifetime in many cases has become shorter and shorter over time. But then if we extend this product lifetime, we're going to reduce the discard, so the amount of products we throw away. And if you have more products in use at any given point in time, then we need less new products because we keep them longer, we hold them longer, and so we buy fewer products. Think of it this way. If we buy a new phone every year, each person, say me or you, will buy one phone every year. So over the course of 5 years, you buy 5 phones that need to be produced. But if we say that the lifetime increases and we buy a phone that lasts and works effectively for 5 years, then over the course of 5 years, we buy 1 phone instead of 5. So this is basically what the product lifetime does. It reduces the amount that we tend to purchase over time. Then what happens here is 2 ramifications. You can see that from here for product purchases, there are a few arrows that originate from here. One that goes to material consumption. So these are the amount of materials that are needed to produce the products that we want. And then we have water consumption, energy consumption, and the energy use gives us CO2 emissions. Now, for each of these indicators, we have employment indicators. So we see employment from material sourcing. So what is the upstream employment for receiving the aluminum, steel, copper, and so on and so forth, plastic molding and materials that we need to produce our products? And then what is the employment that we need for sourcing and providing water and energy? Now, together with retail and employment for production, this is the total supply chain employment for the creation of the products that we're interested in. So this is a more traditional employment creation potential from production. Now, the more interesting part in my view is where we go on with the material flow, where we have, after the product lifetime ends, product discard. And now this is translated from a unit to materials, so tons of materials. That is product waste, not process waste, but product waste. Now here, this accumulates into total stock that could be collected. Of course, collection is higher in more advanced economies. It's lower in least advanced economies. That is something that we can modify over time. And then from that collection, we have the total amount of products that are collected and stored in a facility. Now, from there, we can go to product refurbishment. And if you go to refurbishment of a laptop, it is being sent back into the market as a second-hand product. So it can be resold either in the domestic market or a foreign market, but it reduces the demand for new products. And at the same time, once we have products that are collected, we can either dismantle them and doing recycling and reuse of the materials. This is the flow we see going out on the right side. Or we can send them to landfilling, which is what happens down here. Now, landfilling, as we said, is not only for products that are finished, but also for the materials that are used in the production process. In fact, this flow that we see coming down from the top is product materials to landfill, but we also have production materials to landfill. And this comes from the material consumption. The portion that is waste, what is not recycled and reused, becomes landfilling, and it goes into the stock of landfill materials. Now, from here, we can do incineration as a potential additional intervention. So you can see overall that we have, again, employment from incineration, from landfilling, from materials, repair and reuse, up here from product recycling, from sorting, from collection, and then from the product and not material repair and reuse. So each of these are interconnected with one another depending on these orange variables, which are the policy options we can test with the model. Now, very brief demonstration of how the model works. As I said before, this model runs in a matter of a second or even less. And so what I want to show you now is one feature called synthesing. This allows us to automatically simulate on change. So I have the baseline scenario. Let me call this the policy scenario, changing the simulation name here at the top. Then I click on the synthesing button, and now you see that we have sliders for all the constant variables that we have in the model. So we can move the sliders and change these values. We also have a number of variables that are highlighted in blue, and these are time series that we can modify. So if I click on this product lifetime because I want to change the ownership, I click here, I see a table function showing up that shows me the number of years for the average product lifetime. We have 2000, 2018, historical component, and then 2030, which is the future value. Now I can change this, let's say, to 8 years, typing in 8, and you see the diagram here updates automatically. What I can also do, I can click anywhere here on this line and change manually the trajectory. So if I want a slow improvement because I want to create awareness raising, first I would go with something like this, like a slow change early on and then more change later on. If instead I want to do something decisive, like I want to introduce a standard that says, if you don't have a product that can last 5 years, you need to refund your customers. Now, companies in that case maybe triggering a faster change early on, change product design immediately, and start introducing into the market new products right away. Now, whatever we do here, if we press close and confirm, is being embedded in the model. So we can see immediately, if I click on the product discard and open the graph, that change has generated a decline of about 30% of the product discard. From a little bit more than 1 million products per year, this is electronics, we go down to a bit more than 700,000. Now, this has a few consequences, right? On the one hand, you will see product purchase is declining because, again, we hold longer to the products we have, so we buy fewer. And so that means that the production process will be affected. And if you look at material consumption here, we also see that the amount of products produced and therefore the materials required has declined on the production side. Now, this implies a few things. That on the one hand, we produce less, and so we are going to have less employment from production, from retail, from energy, water. So you see all these indicators, employment from material sourcing and so on, following sort of the same trend you have on the production side. So this is where you see the potential losses on production if you change the ownership level. Then at the same time, what we see is that the product waste generated also declines because we have fewer products that are being thrown away, and so the amount of product waste created declines also. So here, just by doing nothing, we also have a decline in the amount of products that are managed on the waste side. So the total amount of products that we have in the system is smaller. If you look at total employment here, where I have lumped together all the different sources of employment, will be declining. And we can use different tools in the model to figure out what's going on. Here is a tree diagram that represents all the types of jobs that are embedded in the calculation of total employment. But then what we can do also is, of course, test additional intervention options. So what if we change the amount of products that are recycled? So here we have a more complete time series. We go to 2019. If I extend the analysis to 2030 and I bring it up to 100%, what if you're able to increase the amount of product recycled by 2030 to 60%? Let's make it exactly 60. So we have that potential increase here. Now, if I close this variable, I will see here that the products dismantled for recycling and reuse is not declining as much as it did before. You see it starts increasing a bit more now, and it levels off after 2030, because that is where I've stopped my ambition. At the same time, I can introduce other intervention options, like the share of products that are refurbished and resold. It was actually 0. Let's go to 20% by 2030. Now, let's see what happens. In this case, we have created a new type of job because we didn't have product refurbishment before. And we see here the amount of tons of materials that are refurbished corresponding to the type of products or the number of products that we want increases to about 8,000 tons. Now here, the employment for repair and reuse increases from 0 up to 1,500 people per year employed in this specific type of activity. So now if we go back and look at the total employment that we see here on the right side, then we see actually a net gain in the longer term, but we nevertheless have a decline in the short term. Now, we know what has happened in the model, right? This is in a way a white box if you take the time to navigate through the model and see what's going on. We have an immediate decline in the number of jobs from production and from materials management because we have increased the lifetime of products. But then because we are improving the way we manage the smaller amount of waste we have, that is with recycling and reuse, repair and refurbishing, then we are generating more jobs in the medium and longer term. Now, this is what helps us understanding transitions, right? If for a policymaker point of view, reducing these jobs is a no-go, it cannot happen, then we need to think about other complementary intervention options. But if they want to maintain these gain in the longer term, then they cannot avoid dealing with the potential reduction that you have in the short term, if this is the policy they want. So let's see a slightly different scenario where we undo one of the decisions we made before. What if now the product lifetime goes back to 5 years as we had before? Now, as you can imagine, we are not touching production too much, meaning that the total amount of material consumption now you see is a little bit lower, not as low as it was before, but that is due primarily to the fact that now we have this refurbishment that reduces the amount of products we have to buy new because we have them in the second-hand market. And so we shift, in this case, jobs from production entirely to repair and reuse. Now, this is that equity, that inclusiveness discussion we had before. We're basically moving jobs away from the larger producers that produce at scale, large retail shops and so on, to local shops where you may take your laptop, get it fixed, and receive it after 4 or 5 days. So again, this is a way of testing what happens in the model to figure out how to rebalance whatever needs rebalancing. In this case, the allocation of jobs and economic activities across sectors. And in this case, we see that total jobs are actually not declining in the short term. We have an immediate increase because we gain more from refurbishing than from buying new. So we avoid that short-term decline. Nevertheless, and I will conclude here, this is a strategy to create jobs, not to reduce the impact of consumption on the economy. So full circularity will be achieved if you're tackling consumption, avoiding overconsumption, if you're tackling production in an efficient way, and if you're tackling materials management at the same time. So just closing, this is why I believe one of these models or models like this one is very important to understand in a transparent way what happens step by step and how we can introduce policies that can change trends and the course of things in the direction we want, but from a systemic view rather than from a thematic, sectoral, individual point of view. I'll stop here. Mike, over to you if there are more questions.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Andrea. We received one more question from Dora. I believe that you did cover it in some fashion, but I still give the opportunity. How did the circumstances of data collection affect the equations, which we kind of talked about earlier, in my opinion, which would be tied to the data consistency? That would be clearly a data consistency. And then I'll go ahead and bring up my data integrity part as well.
Yes. No, you're right. And there are some tests that we do. On the one hand, we use data to parameterize the model. So without touching the equations, On the other hand, we also use data to set the strength of certain equations. Now, when data are a bit sketchy, we do basically sensitivity analysis. We do Monte Carlo simulation to figure out for a certain range of inputs, what is the change in the outputs that the model generates. Again, in this case, running 10,000 simulations takes no more than 30 seconds. And so it's an easy task that we would always do. Now, of course, we would say if the model is sensitive, we need to pay more attention to that specific number and go search for more data. But otherwise, if the sensitivity is very small, we acknowledge that, but we proceed and work with other type of data or move on to next variables.
There were a number of takeaways that I have personally based on that, Andrea, what you talked about, apart from the fact that your presentation was Christmas, my birthday, and the Easter Bunny all rolled to one. I really enjoyed all of this, but one of the key takeaways I have had nothing to do with your presentation, but everything that is a prerequisite to use this data wisely, and that is to have a very clear policy in advance prior to performing this exercise, because if you don't know what you're trying to achieve, then these statistics have zero meaning or very little meaning, let's put it that way. And very often we think that the statistics are going to be the driver. Actually, the driver has to be the driver, and we use this as a means by which we actually go ahead and reach those goals. Your thoughts on that? No,
I agree. We need to know what the problem is to begin with. We have seen countless exercises where modelers, even very, very high-level modelers, top-notch professors and so on, started modeling the system. And, reality is so complex that you can never capture all of it in one model. So for better or worse, we need to apply a systemic approach to a problem to find a sustainable solution to that problem within the elements of the systems that are critical. We are not quite there in developing super models that can forecast reality in an accurate way. So yes, the problem definition, identifying what is the policy need is paramount. It's step number one.
Mm-hmm. Good. Thank you very much. Maybe if I can give you an opportunity, any possible closing words you might have, and then we'll call it a show.
No, just a brief thank you for you, Mike, for inviting me to speak, and for all those that have attended and the good questions received so far. I hope that you're interested in the use of these tools. Feel free to reach out to Mike and to me directly. I'll be very happy to share more materials on this circular economy application, as well as many other topics related to green economy, green growth, climate adaptation, mitigation. These are the areas I work in, where you need a systemic approach to solve a complex problem.